Shaquille Big Shaq O'Neal, was just a gentle giant, until a cop's racist stop exposed a deadly secret. He's not just a legend, he's an undercover FBI agent. A hidden brotherhood, a buried truth, a city about to erupt. They came for the wrong man. Now justice speaks. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Sometimes the biggest hearts hide in the largest frames, but not everyone bothers to look twice. On the edge of a quiet town outside Atlanta, where cracked sidewalks meet mailboxes decorated with wind chimes and faded pride flags, lives a man whose shadow could stretch across 3 backyards. Shaquille Big Shaq O'Neal isn't just tall, he's a presence. But in this part of the world, size isn't protection, it's suspicion. And in a neighborhood stitched together by second chances and silent histories, Shaq prefers to keep his profile lower than the hush that follows his footsteps. He lives in a modest house, gray brick, not far from a corner bodega with barred windows and a mural of Harriet Tubman painted over old gang tags. The community knows him, not as the NBA legend, not even as Big Shaq, but simply as Mr. Neal, the quiet man who pays for groceries without looking for credit, who lifts broken bikes off sidewalks for local kids and fixes them before they notice. He's been here long enough to be familiar, but mysterious enough to keep questions from forming. What people don't know is that Shaq is on assignment. Not the kind with cameras or wires strapped to his chest, not every day at least. This is deeper, more embedded, the kind of work that comes after years of proving you're more than just muscle, more than just a name on old jerseys and late-night reruns. After years of specialized federal training, psychological operations and behavioral decoding, Shaq was recruited into a discreet, unnamed division of the FBI, one built for cases where power hides behind politics and justice doesn't always wear a robe. This mission was personal. A white supremacist network had been quietly growing roots through local law enforcement agencies across the South, spreading through golf leagues, off-duty brotherhood events, private security firms. On the surface, it looked like just another good old boys club, but beneath the BBQ smoke and county fairs, real hate pulsed, coordinated stops, race-targeted charges, untraceable training events that left people broken or disappeared. These men didn't wear hoods, they wore badges. Shaq had seen the results firsthand. He'd once played for cheering crowds in cities that now whispered rumors about missing black teens and altered coroner reports. The FBI couldn't go in loud. These men had reach inside courtrooms, budget meetings, even the State House. What they needed was someone who could walk unnoticed in plain sight, someone with credibility, restraint, and enough internal strength to carry a lie for years. Shaq had volunteered, not for glory, not even for Preston Vale, the mentor who'd vanished under circumstances that reeked of betrayal. Shaq did it because the truth needed someone big enough to stand inside it and not flinch. The mission started slow. He built his cover as a semi-retired philanthropist who wanted to reconnect with his roots. That's how he phrased it when nosy neighbors asked why someone like him lived here, and not in a mansion with gates. He told them he liked peace. They didn't believe him, but they accepted it. Every morning he walked the same route, past the elementary school mural, where the paint peeled like memory, to Dixon's Hardware, where he volunteered 2 days a week fixing donated appliances for low-income homes. The owner, Melvin Dixon, a wiry Vietnam vet with a Purple Heart pinned to his register, took to Shaq instantly, called him Quiet Thunder, said he'd never met a man so gentle with a wrench. Shaq just smiled, grateful for the normalcy. But underneath that normalcy, he mapped patterns. He knew which officers made routine traffic stops near the community center on Saturdays. He logged which patrol cars loitered near Delaney Park after sunset, where young black couples were often questioned or dismissed from the basketball courts. Shaq saw it all. Didn't interfere. Not yet. His job was to observe, record, and report to a handler whose voice he only knew as Frost. A ghost on the other end of encrypted calls who never offered more than 2 words. Stay sharp. Shaq's house had a second basement, a hidden chamber beneath the standard storm shelter. In it, 4 hard drives, a decrypted laptop, a bulletin board covered with maps, photographs, old academy yearbooks with faces circled in red. It was here that Shaq transformed into what the agency unofficially called a silent sentinel. He collected patterns, language, facial tics, patrol rhythms, the subtleties most would miss, like which officer always kept their body cam tilted slightly upward to crop out others, or which one rubbed his neck twice before calling in a stop, a code used among Iron Fathers to signal a black male suspect. Shaq didn't speak to many, but the ones he did, he remembered. There was Miss Clarine, the retired librarian, who sold lemonade at the community garden. She once told Shaq about her nephew, a sweet boy who got himself locked up for trying to be too polite to a cop who wanted the opposite. The story sat in Shaq's gut like wet cement. There was little Nate, a 12-year-old kid whose older brother vanished during a traffic stop 6 months ago. Official story said he fled the scene, but Shaq had pulled streetlight footage. No one ran. Someone was taken. Shaq kept his heart from boiling over by remembering what his mother once told him. Sometimes, son, we fight best by not showing we're in the ring at all. Lucille O'Neill, fierce, poetic, the kind of woman who believed in God, casseroles, and consequence. Shaq still heard her voice some nights when he returned home, showered in silence, and logged his notes into the encrypted system. Her voice kept him balanced, kept the hate out. But balance didn't mean safety. There were always signs he was being watched too closely. An unfamiliar SUV parked across the street, too many times a week. A flicker in his power that conveniently skipped the cameras but not the fridge. The kind of quiet intimidation you couldn't prove but couldn't ignore either. He logged those too. Every subtle move, every curious glance from the same red-haired officer who always smiled too tightly at the community barbecues. What the world didn't know was that Shaq had given up being famous in exchange for being invisible, because invisibility let him listen, and listening got him closer to the truth than fame ever did. That morning, just before the first major turn in this quiet war, Shaq walked into Miller's barber shop where 3 black men discussed the recent rise in incidents. Young black men arrested for loitering in places they'd grown up around. No news coverage, no names released, just echoes. One man leaned back and said, "Ain't nobody coming to fix this." The room hummed in agreement. Shaq sat, waited his turn, but his mind was racing. Because deep in his encrypted inbox sat a red flag report forwarded from Frost. It read, "Pattern escalation confirmed. Embedded units compromised. Initiate secondary infiltration protocol. Confirm identity of Officer Rutledge. High priority target." Shaq had seen the name before. Officer Cole Rutledge. Mid-30s. Southern drawl. Clean record. But too clean. The kind of record where complaints disappear, and transfers look like promotions. A legacy officer. 3rd generation. One of the names circled in red on Shaq's wall. Shaq tucked the report into his coat, paid for his lineup, and walked back out into the sun-soaked street. He didn't know it yet, but by that evening he'd be pulled over on suspicion of aggressive posturing. The irony wouldn't be lost on him. A 7-foot black man with his hands in his pockets, walking home, viewed as a threat by a man half his size with twice the malice. He wouldn't resist. He wouldn't argue. He'd smile, give his ID, and record every word. Because that stop wasn't a setback. It was the beginning of exposure. The bait. And it would be the moment when Officer Rutledge made the mistake that would unravel everything. Big Shaq didn't need to swing. He just needed to stand. And that's what scared them the most. Because giants like him weren't meant to hide in shadows. They were meant to reveal what's hiding in everyone else. Not every uniform stands for justice, and not every badge tells the truth. The sun hit like judgment that morning, bright, direct, and without apology. Shaq moved through the neighborhood as he always did, deliberately calm, hands loose at his sides, breathing steady. His frame caught every shadow, his presence every glance. People often said he was too big to blend in. They didn't understand he wasn't trying to. He was trying not to give anyone a reason. That was the difference between being noticed and being targeted. Shaq had just left Dixon's Hardware with a toolkit for Miss Clarine. Her ceiling fan had been rattling since last week, and she hadn't called maintenance since her nephew got roughed up outside his job by a cop in a marked SUV. She didn't say it out loud, but Shaq could read the shift in her voice. That rattling fan wasn't the only thing broken. People's trust was splintered, and it creaked with every story that ended in someone going missing. He walked the sidewalk like he always did, slow, wide arcs, always keeping space between himself and anyone who might panic at a tall black man carrying a toolbox. His hands were visible, always. That was the rule. Unofficial, unspoken, passed down from mother to son, generation to generation like a warning in their bones. Never give them a reason to say they felt unsafe. But safety in this town wasn't something Shaq controlled. The cruiser pulled up too slow to be casual. Blacked out windows. Standard issue Dodge. No lights. Just tension painted in blue and steel. Shaq clocked the driver before the window even rolled down. He knew that silhouette. Broad shoulders. Clean-shaved fade. The twitch in his left hand on the wheel. Officer Cole Rutledge. Shaq exhaled. Turned his body slightly toward the curb. Just enough to appear compliant. Still, the cruiser didn't move. Then came the whoop of the siren. Short, sharp, a bark more than a signal. The window came down halfway, and there it was, that voice. Southern-tipped, clipped, and cocky, like it came out of a training manual soaked in vinegar.
"Sir, mind stepping over here for a moment?"
Shaq turned fully. "Everything all right, officer?" Rutledge smiled, but it never reached his eyes. Just a routine stop. Got a call about a suspicious individual carrying unknown tools down this way. Shaq said nothing. He knew the playbook. Delay, escalate, force a response. The goal wasn't resolution, it was submission. He handed over his ID, moving slow and open-palmed. Rutledge took it, barely looked. "Big guy like you," he said, eyeing Shaq up and down. "Ever think about doing security work? Could put that size to use instead of creeping around with a wrench." Shaq's face didn't move. Inside, though, he felt the familiar pressure rise in his chest. Not anger, but memory. His mother's voice in his ears like a rhythm. "They'll say your size is aggression. Make sure your silence is louder." He gave a small nod, just fixing a ceiling fan for a neighbor. Rutledge leaned in. "That right? You got proof of that?" Shaq didn't blink. "The address is on the ID." Rutledge chuckled, took a step closer. He had the air of a man who'd never been questioned, whose authority had never been challenged without consequence. "Funny thing about giants," he said. "They forget whose shoulders they're standing on." The phrase stuck. Shaq knew it wasn't just about height. It was a reference, a code, a phrase that popped up more than once in Iron Father's literature. Language meant to sound poetic, but was actually a threat. Shaq felt the shift then. This wasn't about him. It was a message. Still calm, still composed. Shaq reached into his jacket, slow, deliberate, and pressed the silent trigger on the hidden body cam, clipped beneath his collar. It buzzed once, then went dark. Recording had begun. Rutledge stepped behind him now, circling. A predator without need for speed. "You ever get the feeling you don't quite belong here, Mr. O'Neill?" he asked. Shaq didn't respond. That question wasn't meant for dialogue. "You see," Rutledge went on, "there's a rhythm to this town. It runs a certain way. A man like you walking around, pretending to be regular, that disrupts things, makes folks nervous." That word pretending stuck harder than it should have, because for once it was technically true. Shaq wasn't just fixing ceiling fans. He was deep under. He was wearing a layer no one could see. But the way Rutledge said it, with that smug grin, felt less like suspicion and more like accusation. "Tell you what," Rutledge said. "Why don't we take a little ride? Clear a few things up at the station." Shaq turned then, finally, looked Rutledge in the eye. Not confrontational, just clear.
"Am I being detained, officer?"
Rutledge paused, then smiled again, this time tighter. "No, sir. Just making a friendly suggestion." Shaq nodded once, took his ID back, and stepped away. The sidewalk felt longer now, like it stretched farther with every step. The cruiser didn't move, not until Shaq turned the corner. He knew that wasn't the end. That was just the beginning of something bigger. Later that night, in the quiet of his basement command post, Shaq replayed the footage. Every word, every angle. He logged the language, timestamp, posture. Then he opened the file on Rutledge, added a note. Escalation phase initiated. Verbal intimidation confirmed. Language consistent with Iron Father's coded speech. Recommend priority surveillance. But even as he typed, his hands moved slower. Something about that exchange, it lingered. Not just the hostility. Not just the weight of being sized up like livestock in plain clothes. It was the familiarity. The way Rutledge didn't ask questions. The way he talked like he already knew everything. Shaq leaned back, stared at the ceiling. That phrase echoed again. They forget whose shoulders they're standing on. He opened a separate file, one not shared with the agency, labeled simply, Vale. He typed the phrase into the archive search. 3 hits, all in Preston Vale's field notes from his last active case. And suddenly, what felt like a routine stop became something far more loaded. Shaq thought of Lucille again, her voice distant but unwavering. "You're not invisible, just unseen. There's a difference. Never forget it." This mission was no longer a chess game. It was personal. It had always been personal. He just hadn't allowed himself to admit it. Not until Rutledge said the quiet part out loud. The line between duty and vengeance blurred that night, but Shaq didn't move the line. He just made damn sure the FBI would see it when he crossed it. Some uniforms hide more than guns. They hide legacies of hate. There's a difference between secrets and ghosts. Secrets can be buried. Ghosts linger. And in law enforcement, where history is filed in manila folders and locked drawers, ghosts live between the lines. Shaq had spent the past 5 nights rewatching every frame of his encounter with Rutledge, not to relive it, but to extract something. A pause. A phrase. A flicker of overconfidence in Rutledge's voice that didn't match a routine stop. Shaq wasn't looking at a rogue cop. He was looking at a practiced one. The kind of man who knew just how far he could push the line without stepping over it. And that kind of precision didn't come from training alone. It came from legacy. The next morning, Shaq took a different route to Dixon's. Not for errands, but surveillance. There was a municipal storage building 3 blocks east of the precinct. Rarely trafficked except by clerks, often used to house old case files, too inconvenient to digitize. Shaq had already checked the employee rotation. Thursdays, the only access clerk on duty was a man named Leo Kinnett, soft-spoken, in his 60s, and recently passed over for early retirement. The kind of man who still believed in the nobility of the badge, even if it had long stopped believing in him. Shaq brought coffee and an old football from his LSU days, claiming he needed files for a community mentorship event. Kinnett let him in without hesitation. Inside, Shaq scanned the metal cabinets labeled with fading Sharpie, 2003, 2007, 2008, 2012. He pulled drawers quickly, but carefully. He wasn't looking for arrest records. He was looking for patterns, traffic stops, excessive force reports, sealed IA complaints, anything with Rutledge's name or badge number. What he found instead was far worse. 3 separate reports spread out over 7 years, all involving group training exercises conducted off-record in a remote property owned by the Belgrave Union Hunting Lodge. The same lodge, according to Shaq's background check, once belonged to Sheriff Warren Rutledge, Cole's grandfather. That's when the term first appeared in black ink under a blurred complaint header. Possible ties to Iron Fathers. The report was half redacted, submitted by an officer with no badge number listed, just initials, PV. Shaq's throat tightened. There it was, Preston Vale's fingerprint. Back at home, he double encrypted the files, cross-referenced old FBI training modules, and pulled up legacy databases no longer active but archived under his clearance. When he typed Iron Fathers, the results were sparse. Not surprising. The group had never officially been designated as a threat organization, and their operations were designed to avoid digital trails. They weren't modern extremists. They were legacy builders, sons, grandsons, and nephews carrying on the quiet work of systemic control through policy, procedure, and selective violence. They didn't use tattoos. They used task forces. Shaq traced multiple officers who'd rotated through counties across Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, all trained in the same academy, all mentored by the same senior officer, Warren Rutledge. Most had clean records, but several were linked to off-duty incidents, civil suits quietly settled, and in one case, a missing persons investigation closed without resolution. All notes in these files shared the same coded references. T-74, Black Mask, Rise Days. He dug deeper into the symbols. T-74 matched a page number in an old Iron Fathers manifesto. Preston had once shown Shaq during their earliest field assignments. Page 74 detailed their ascension path, a euphemism for initiation. Not into a gang, into belief. It wasn't just about hate, it was about strategy. Their goal wasn't to scare the community, it was to control it, by reshaping the very structures that governed it. They didn't burn crosses, they passed ordinances. They didn't lynch, they redistricted, gerrymandered, suppressed. Shaq stared at the screen, the cursor blinking like a metronome, counting down something unseen. He clicked a folder labeled Flagged Memos, 2010, buried under deprecated server access. What he found sent a cold knot to the base of his spine. A memo, FBI letterhead, time-stamped October 19. Subject: Iron Fathers, embedded law enforcement personnel. Summary: following the investigation of covert recruitment efforts by Iron Fathers within Georgia Sheriff Departments, Agent P. Vale submitted sufficient evidence for a formal probe. Due to internal political pressures and lack of interagency cooperation, case has been formally suspended. Agent reassigned to special risk monitoring. No further action taken. But in the right-hand corner, someone had scrawled a handwritten note, barely legible. Val won't let it go. Watch him. Shaq zoomed in on the note. The initials were blurred, but the implications weren't. The next file in the sequence was Vale's personnel report, a notice of psychological leave, citing increased paranoia and inability to disengage from closed cases. 1 month later, another file, death by suicide, no note found, body recovered from Lake DeLorme. Shaq remembered that funeral. He remembered sitting alone in the back row. No flag, no ceremony, just rain and shame. But he also remembered the final voicemail Vale had left on his phone. One that never made sense until now. If you find the badge in the mirror, don't salute it. Break the glass. Shaq never understood it. Thought it was metaphorical. A man spiraling from too many sleepless nights. But now, it was literal. The badge, the reflection of justice, was compromised, corrupted. And the man who tried to expose it was buried by the same system he tried to save. Shaq leaned back, head pounding. The Iron Fathers weren't just surviving. They were winning. And now, they were watching him. He turned back to Rutledge's file. His academy records, internal promotions, commendations, all perfect, too perfect. It read like a resume pre-written by someone else. But then Shaq noticed a single discrepancy. A recommendation letter for Rutledge's academy application, signed by someone outside the chain of command, Marla Kine. That name again. He had seen it on his deep cover authorization documents, the woman who signed off on his placement. The very woman who gave him his mission. Why would someone so far removed from the county level be involved in Rutledge's career over a decade ago? Shaq felt his stomach shift. This wasn't just about infiltration. It was about orchestration. He printed the redacted memo, highlighted the initials, and pinned it next to Preston's photo on the wall. The photo was old from their first joint op. Preston's arm draped over Shaq's shoulder, both smiling like the world was still black and white. But the world was grayer now, fogged in corruption and quiet betrayal. And Shaq realized something brutal. He wasn't just chasing ghosts. He was chasing men who made ghosts. It started with a spilled cup and ended with a silent alliance. The doorbell chime at Midnight Brew didn't just ring, it clanged like a slow church bell, echoing across the small shop with a rhythm as intentional as its regulars. The place had soul, exposed brick painted matte black, reclaimed wood counters, ceiling fans that whispered more than they spun. Jazz spilled low from a vintage record player tucked behind a bookshelf labeled "Take One, Leave One." It wasn't a coffee shop. It was a confessional without a pulpit. Shaq entered quietly, stooping under the doorframe, and the usual quiet conversation in the corners lifted just enough to acknowledge him. People didn't flock to him here. They respected the distance. But that didn't mean they weren't curious. He was too big, too composed, too exacting in his movements not to draw attention, especially in a place that drew in local artists, activists, and the quietly angry. She saw him before he saw her. Delaney Rivers. Braids like ropes of ink, coiled into a crown. One hand on the espresso lever, the other punching in podcast notes on her tablet with a stylus that had seen better days. She didn't wear her history on her sleeve. It was in her silence. Delaney wasn't the kind of woman who raised her voice. She didn't have to. The weight in her eyes did most of the talking. Shaq stepped up to the counter. Before he could speak, she slid a cup toward him. Already poured. Black coffee. No sugar. No cream. He raised an eyebrow. "You've come in at exactly 8:42 every Thursday for 3 weeks," she said, not looking up. "Always scan the room before sitting. Sit at the far right window. Never finish the cup." Shaq chuckled lightly, surprised. "That so?" Delaney finally looked up. Her voice didn't change, but her gaze sharpened. "You're not here for the caffeine." Shaq held the cup, let the warmth settle into his palm. He said nothing. "Name's Delaney," she added, flipping the tablet closed. "Most folks know me from Echo Line." Shaq nodded. The podcast. He'd listened to 3 episodes already. Local stories, systemic injustice, deep dives into wrongful arrests, housing discrimination, and the quiet mechanics of modern racism. Her voice on the podcast was steady, factual, but it was the episode titled "Southside Stop That Stole My Brother" that stuck with him. The voice cracked once in that one. She never acknowledged it. "You record in here?" he asked, finally. "Back room," she replied. "Better soundproofed than you'd expect. Built the walls myself." Shaq glanced around. The shop was no accident. Every detail was designed. There were no cops on the wall of community photos. No flags, no forced patriotism. Just faces. Brown, black, and defiant. Delaney tilted her head. "What's a man like you doing in a place like this?" "Trying to fix ceiling fans," Shaq answered, smiling slightly. She didn't smile back. "I know what Rutledge did to your brother," Shaq added, lowering his voice. Delaney's jaw tensed. "Then you know the system's not broken. It's working exactly how it was designed." Shaq took a sip. Bitter. Strong. Exactly as expected. "I think the system has a crack," he said. "Just deep enough for someone to wedge it open." Delaney narrowed her eyes. "And who would do the wedging?" Shaq didn't answer. He didn't need to. They stared at each other for a moment too long. No challenge. Just understanding. Delaney stepped out from behind the counter, nodding toward the back. "Come with me." The room behind the cafe was small but functional. Acoustic panels layered like puzzle pieces across the walls. Mic arms suspended over a narrow table cluttered with printouts and redacted documents. But it was the board on the left wall that stopped Shaq in his tracks. It was a mosaic of injustice. Photos, timelines, mugshots, body cam stills. Every face pinned had a badge. Every arrow led to a name, most of them marked with one word: dismissed. Delaney stood beside it, arms folded. My brother's name was Kendrick. He was 17 when Rutledge pulled him over for erratic lane behavior. The dashcam showed him using a turn signal. They said he resisted. He didn't. They said drugs were in the trunk. None were logged. He was sentenced to 6 years for obstruction and possession. They sent him to Briarstone. Shaq's brows furrowed. That facility's been shut down 2 years. Delaney nodded slowly. That's what they told me too. Then I got a postcard. She handed it to Shaq. The ink was faint, nearly unreadable, but the signature was unmistakable. K. Rivers. I don't know where he is, she said. I don't know what they did to him, but I know Rutledge signed off on the transfer. I requested the documents. They couldn't be located. Shaq reached into his coat and unfolded the memo, the one with Preston Vale's initials, linking Rutledge to Iron Fathers. Delaney scanned it, her lips parting slightly. He's part of it, she whispered. I knew it. Shaq pointed to a note at the bottom of the page. This language, shoulders they stand on. That phrase is part of a recruitment script. They pass it down. Rutledge didn't just arrest your brother. He processed him into a network. Delaney took a step back, the realization hitting her all at once. They're not just hiding their crimes. They're building something. Shaq nodded. And it's bigger than this town. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of it all pressing the air flat between them. I need eyes on the ground, Shaq said. People who see things I can't, who hear things I won't. You want me to be a snitch? No, Shaq replied. I want you to be a signal. Delaney didn't hesitate. Done. Over the next week, their alliance deepened without words. She'd pass small notes with Shaq's coffee cup. Lists of names, places, conversations overheard. In return, he shared parts of the investigation she'd never seen. Surveillance logs, officer rotations, shell organizations tied to Iron Fathers through real estate and private security contracts. They never spoke about the alliance in public, but the rhythm of it grew. A spilled cup became a coded drop. A napkin with a crease became an alert. Midnight brew became the epicenter of a silent storm brewing just beneath the calm surface of a city blind to its own rot. One night after closing, Delaney unlocked a drawer Shaq hadn't noticed before. Inside, an old USB drive wrapped in cloth. She held it out. Kendrick mailed it a year before he vanished, she said. I haven't plugged it in. I didn't want to believe it was real. Shaq took it carefully, nodding. I'll decrypt it. As he stepped out into the night, a soft breeze carried the scent of roasting beans and memory. He looked back once, saw Delaney silhouetted in the window, a sentinel in her own right. She had nothing left to lose. And that made her the most dangerous ally of all. When you chase ghosts, sometimes you find their unfinished business still breathing. Shaq always believed the truth left footprints. No matter how well someone swept the floor, there was always dust caught in corners, scuff marks hiding beneath furniture. He didn't need proof of the Iron Fathers' existence anymore. He needed to understand their architecture, how they survived, how they grew, and more urgently, how many still wore a badge and called themselves protectors. The USB drive Delaney had handed him sat on the steel desk beneath the red lamp in his basement office. He had stared at it for 3 hours before plugging it in. Fear didn't stop him. Hope did. Because if Kendrick's last message held what Shaq suspected, then the problem wasn't just systemic, it was sanctioned. He ran the decryption in offline mode. No network, no surveillance. The files were messy, half were corrupted audio logs, and others were still images labeled by date only. The last folder was named Blackfield. Inside, Shaq found digital scans of 5 arrest records, all from different counties, all over the span of a decade. The charges varied: trespassing, assault, loitering, resisting arrest, but the faces in the mugshots told the story. Black, male, all under 25, no priors. The fingerprints were identical in 2 of the reports, yet listed under different names, and all 5 men had been transferred to rehabilitation centers, operated under a private organization called Bastion Liberty Services, a name Shaq hadn't seen before but immediately flagged. He cross-checked the corporation against government contracts and discovered it didn't officially exist until a year after Kendrick's disappearance. Its founding documents were signed by a man named Thatcher Lynn, a former state policy advisor with no law enforcement background but deep financial ties to prison maintenance firms and behavioral reprogramming NGOs. There were no board members listed, no operational website, just a P.O. box in Montgomery, and a long string of quiet quarterly revenue filings. Shaq leaned back in his chair. This was no longer about dirty cops. This was about logistics, a pipeline, a system designed to erase people legally without drawing blood. He needed access to internal arrest records, the kind that didn't live in digital police databases, the kind locked in paper form, tucked in metal cabinets beneath city halls and precincts, that still smelled like ashtrays and old sweat. That's how he found himself parked outside the now defunct Marshall County Records Annex, a building technically closed to the public for structural repairs, but still accessible with the right badge, one he had courtesy of a former FBI contact who owed him more than a favor. Inside, the air was thick with mildew and old bureaucracy. Shaq found the storage vaults where incident logs were still filed by precinct date. One box for every week. He didn't have long. He moved through the boxes methodically, looking for any name that appeared more than once under Rutledge's patrol beat. What he found instead was a folder marked closed under internal override, an unusual tag that meant IA Internal Affairs had once been involved but had been overridden. Shaq opened the folder. The first report was dated 6 years ago. The complaint came from an officer named Tanner Diggs, now deceased. His handwritten notes were preserved inside the file, and they were damning. He detailed a pattern of coordinated arrests and suspect transfers that bypassed booking protocols and used falsified paperwork to move detainees to private disciplinary hubs. He named 2 officers. One was Rutledge. The other name had been redacted by hand, not with a stamp, with a marker. Shaq photographed everything. His phone was on airplane mode, GPS disabled. He didn't trust the cloud. He trusted printed evidence and whispers from the past. Back at home, he laid everything out on the table like puzzle pieces. The arrests, the missing men, the fake overdoses listed on their so-called death certificates. Every overdose occurred in custody. Every one was written up by the same state medical examiner, Dr. Ryland Birch, who'd retired suddenly last fall. Shaq accessed the National Board's archives. Birch's license had been revoked in another state under a different name, a previous identity sealed under witness protection. Somehow this man had re-emerged with clearance to conduct autopsies for state law enforcement in Georgia. There were no digital trails linking him to Iron Fathers, but the pattern was enough. That night, Shaq couldn't sleep. He pulled up Preston Vale's old voice memos, raw, unfiltered recordings from an analog recorder, converted to digital. Preston had once documented every lead aloud, thinking out loud when he couldn't trust anyone else. His voice still held the weight of belief back then, but with a creeping sadness. Shaq sat in the dark, listening. "The problem isn't finding the crime," Preston had said in one recording. "It's proving someone ever existed long enough to be a victim of it. When the system buries you on paper, it doesn't need to bury you in dirt." Then, a click. A pause. "I followed one case too far. Kid named Ronald May. Arrested for shoplifting. He was 14. No record of the arrest after transfer. Found his name in a social worker's caseload. She filed an inquiry. Went missing a week later. I was told to reallocate my focus." That was the phrase. Reallocate. Another pause. "I've started hiding copies. If anything happens to me, they'll know it wasn't a breakdown." Shaq's jaw tightened. He closed the audio file and opened a new tab. Began tracing names from Vale's old logs. Some were dead. Some were missing. But one name still had a traceable address. Lana Morse, former social worker. Last known residence, Augusta. The next morning, Shaq drove out before dawn. No surveillance. No digital comms. Car stripped of tags. The house was a small brick ranch, overgrown with vines. Mailbox rusted, but someone was home. Lana opened the door slowly, warily. A middle-aged white woman with soft eyes and hands that trembled slightly. Shaq didn't introduce himself. He just held up one of the mugshots Kendrick had found, one she had reported all those years ago. Her face crumpled. "They told me he overdosed," she whispered. "They told everyone that," Shaq replied. "But the signature on the autopsy came from a man who used a false name." Lana stepped aside. She didn't ask who Shaq was. She simply led him to a storage room, where she kept files no one else wanted. Paper trails. Dozens of them. Reports she was told to discard after they were handled. She hadn't. Something in her wouldn't let her. "They changed the transfer process after 2011, she explained. "Started using private contractors. Told us it was for efficiency, but the kids never came back." Shaq asked if she ever heard the phrase Iron Fathers. She nodded slowly. "Once. In a meeting with 2 officers. They said it like a joke, but it wasn't funny." Before he left, Lana handed him a sealed envelope. "I was going to send this to the Department of Justice. Never got the courage. Maybe now's the time." Inside were sealed affidavits, names, case numbers, and one photo, grainy but clear enough, Preston Vale shaking hands with a man whose badge had been blurred out. The ghosts hadn't just left trails. They had faces. And Shaq was ready to name them all. Heroes don't always wear capes, but monsters often wear stars. Shaq knew the shift when it came. It wasn't a loud knock at the door or a SWAT truck on the lawn. It was smaller, quieter, precision-aimed, a parking ticket tucked under his windshield when he hadn't moved the car in days, a flicker in the hallway light outside his apartment that hadn't buzzed before. A maintenance notice slid into his mailbox, dated but unsigned, from a company that hadn't serviced the building in years. And then the obvious one. The envelope slid open and resealed with a cheap glue stick. His mother's letter inside was untouched, but the message was crystal. They'd read it. It meant they knew he was too close. Shaq didn't flinch. He logged the events, time-stamped them, filed photos under off-network protocols, and backed everything to encrypted drives. He'd dealt with intimidation tactics before, but this wasn't a threat. This was choreography, a dance of power meant to remind him that someone was watching his steps, deciding how far he was allowed to move. The final straw wasn't subtle. A summons arrived. Issued by the County Integrity Review Board, stamped in red. Allegation of officer threat, under Section 47A, disruptive behavior toward law enforcement. The complainant? Deputy Cole Rutledge. The accusation was absurd. Shaq had the entire roadside stop on video. Rutledge had baited him, circled him like prey. But the complaint wasn't about truth. It was about process. They didn't need him guilty. They needed him stalled, occupied, exposed. Review boards took weeks. He'd be tied up in hearings, interviews, protocol. It would bury his investigation under red tape, while the Iron Fathers scrubbed their tracks clean. Delaney called that night, voice shaking. They got in. Shaq froze. What happened? I came home. Door was open. Apartment trashed. Files gone. Microphones gone. My podcast site, it's gone, Shaq. The whole archive. Every backup file, deleted from the cloud. My server was shut down. He asked if she was okay. I wasn't there, she said. But they knew what to take. They left the furniture. Just the tech. Just the names. Shaq's fists curled, but he kept his tone level. Where are you now? At Midnight Brew. Locked in the back with the lights off. Stay there. Don't move. I'm coming. 15 minutes later, he arrived. The shop was dark, except for the faint red light behind the bar. Delaney opened the back door quietly, pale and pacing. Her confidence was cracked, not broken, but the anger simmering in her movements was sharper than grief. This was supposed to be my story, she said, not my sentence. Shaq sat across from her. They escalated because we got too close. That's how they work. Hit your identity. Hit your voice. Delaney stared at the floor. They don't need to kill you. They just need to erase your credibility. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The air was heavy with truth. But what came next pulled it tighter. I pulled Kendrick's transfer records again, she whispered. This time through a back door in a welfare program database. Someone logged a secondary relocation 2 years ago. Different facility. Shaq leaned in. Name it. Delaney pushed a printout toward him. One line in the system. Transferred to FL52 Safe Rest Facility. Status active monitoring. Shaq blinked. There's no such place. I know, she said. It doesn't appear on any registry, no physical address. But a billing number exists. They invoice through a shell corporation. Bastion Liberty Services, Shaq muttered. Delaney looked up. You've seen it too. He nodded, slowly. They're running private prisons under non-profit covers, facilities that don't exist on maps, protected by jurisdictional loopholes. They're funneling inmates through backdoor arrests, but the ones with media attention get processed. The ones without? They vanish, Delaney finished. Shaq's mind moved faster than his hands now. He stood, went to the hidden compartment under the floorboard where he stored field notes. He pulled Vale's final collection, photocopies of badge logs, marked transfer requests, internal complaints from unnamed officers. One name circled more than once, Supervisor T. Lin. We need proof Kendrick was there, Shaq said. Not just a record, visual, testimony, something they can't redact. And if we don't find him? Delaney asked, voice barely audible. We will. The next day, the intimidation sharpened. Shaq walked out to his car to find his tires slashed. No cameras had caught it. Later, at the precinct for the first round of his review board proceedings, a familiar officer leaned too close when scanning his badge and whispered, "Lot of heat for a handyman." Shaq sat in a conference room beneath buzzing fluorescent lights, while two men in ill-fitting suits asked leading questions. Did he threaten Rutledge? Did he raise his voice? Did he appear agitated or intimidating? The game was obvious. They were trying to define his body as a weapon, his presence as a threat. But Shaq had recordings, timestamps, statements from 2 witnesses at the store nearby. The board didn't care. Their questions were procedural, their expressions blank. The entire process was performance. They weren't there to find truth. They were there to buy time, time for Iron Fathers to clean their mess. Back at Midnight Brew, Delaney dug deeper. The podcast might have been wiped, but the listeners weren't. One of them, a former IT contractor named Micah Red, reached out after seeing the sudden disappearance of her site. He claimed he'd mirrored some of her old episodes for personal use, and had built an offline archive. When Shaq and Delaney met him, they expected a handful of files. What Micah gave them was a full digital library, including metadata from server logs that showed an IP address traced to a government building in Montgomery had pinged her site hours before it was taken down. They had root access, Micah explained. That means they didn't hack it, they were already inside. Shaq's silence deepened. This wasn't rogue. It was sanctioned. Delaney looked at him. They're not trying to kill the message. They're trying to rewrite it. That night, Shaq stared at his wall again. The timeline, the names, the red string tracing from arrest to disappearance. At the center sat one name now, Kendrick Rivers. Not just a missing person. He was the linchpin. If they could find him alive, they could burn this thing down. The only question was whether they were already too late. In abandoned spaces, sometimes the loudest truths are whispered. The wind was different near the river, slower, colder, like it remembered things. Shaq stood on the edge of a fenced lot in the industrial dead zone east of the city, staring at a crumbling warehouse with its windows long shattered and its roof sagging like tired shoulders. The paint on the sign had peeled, but the old company name still clung in ghosted letters. Marson Freight and Supply. According to the city's official records, it was scheduled for demolition 3 years ago. According to Delaney's dig through archival zoning maps, it was never supposed to exist. They got there just before midnight, dressed in dark coats, no headlights, moving silent. This wasn't recon, it was a recovery mission. Micah's analysis of Kendrick's digital trail had revealed something strange. A metadata ping from a handheld device, Kendrick's, that had bounced off a router located just a block from this warehouse. The timestamp? 8 days after his supposed transfer to a non-existent rehabilitation center. Shaq cut through the fence with a bolt cutter he'd borrowed from Dixon's, and they moved inside, stepping over glass and crumpled beer cans. The place smelled like rust, dust, and old smoke. It had the feel of a place that hadn't just been abandoned, but deliberately forgotten. The wide bay doors were shut tight, but the side entrance, a warped wooden slab, gave way with a groan that echoed across the empty shell of the building. Inside, the air was thick. The walls were scorched in places, as if fires had been lit in desperation, not warmth. What remained of the floor was a mix of splintered boards and concrete patches, but it was what stood in the center of the room that made Shaq freeze. A small platform, notched with wooden steps and rows of old church pews arranged before it like a courtroom left to rot. The lighting rig above was makeshift, with hanging cords still swaying slightly, as if disturbed moments ago. But this place wasn't built for worship. It was built for performance. Delaney whispered, "It looks like a sermon hall." Shaq nodded. No microphones, just proximity. This was intimate, controlled. They walked between the pews, careful not to disturb anything. Shaq examined the wood, solid oak, bolted to the floor. But beneath the second row, something caught his eye. A strip of black duct tape, aged and curling. He reached under the bench and peeled it back, revealing a folded envelope, sealed in plastic, pressed flat against the underside of the seat. He pulled it out slowly. Inside were printed pages, manifesto-style documents, their fonts militaristic and serifed, like they were trying to sound older than they were. The first page bore the title, Doctrine of Restoration, Tier 2. The language was coded but unmistakable. Reassertion of traditional hierarchies, uncompromised bloodlines, and community cleansing through correctional pathways. Further down, it described methods for identifying traitors within law enforcement and judiciary circles. They used euphemisms like paper disavowal and chain severance. Shaq knew what they meant: termination, elimination, erasure without fingerprints. Delaney found another packet under a nearby pew. Hers had photos, candid surveillance shots, most taken in daylight. One was of a state judge, another of a social worker, Lana Morse. And then came the twist of the knife. A third photo, Preston Vale, seated in a folding chair, hands behind his back, a hood partially pulled off. His eyes were wide, unfocused but alive. The timestamp was 6 months after his official date of death. Delaney covered her mouth. He was alive. Shaq didn't speak. He was staring at the photo, memorizing every wrinkle, every pixel. This wasn't just proof of Preston's murder. It was proof of a cover-up that extended beyond law enforcement. The man who trained him, who refused to let go of the investigation, wasn't broken by obsession. He was executed for getting too close. They continued searching. Shaq found a compartment in the platform's base, nailed shut. He pried it open with the edge of a broken flashlight. Inside were laminated ID badges, dozens of them. Some active-duty cops, others retired. A few bore county clerk seals, others from juvenile detention facilities. They weren't trophies, they were networks, recruits, collaborators. But what chilled him was the document at the bottom. A burn list, literally labeled Combust Index. On it, names, ranks, location codes. Each marked either C, contained, R, reassigned, or E, eliminated. Delaney flipped through the names. Kendrick's wasn't there. Shaq exhaled. He's not listed. Because they didn't finish with him, she said. Or they lost track. That possibility scared them more than anything. Suddenly, a sound, soft, distant, deliberate. A click. They both froze. Delaney stepped back, ducking low. Shaq pulled out his encrypted transmitter, the one with a direct ping to a dormant FBI satellite relay. It vibrated once, then again. No active signal, he said, but someone just tripped a motion sensor. Security. Shaq scanned the ceiling. No, movement, light shift, someone else is here. They killed their flashlights, waited, listened. More sounds, soft dragging, not footsteps, not boots, like plastic on metal. Shaq grabbed Delaney's hand and led her behind the pews, crouching low. From their vantage, they saw a faint shape move in the far corner, tall, hunched, dragging something wrapped in cloth. Then a voice. "You're late." It wasn't directed at them. The voice came from a speaker, a pre-recorded message, likely triggered by motion. A training video, maybe, but it played like a sermon. "You're here because this world has forgotten what it means to respect order. The badge doesn't make the man, the blood does." Delaney whispered, "This is recruitment. This is where they did it." Shaq nodded. "And someone still maintains this site, still uses it." The figure in the distance disappeared behind a wall partition. Shaq and Delaney used the distraction to move toward the back exit. They pushed open a fire door that led out into a narrow alley behind the warehouse coated in grime. They didn't run, they walked, fast and quiet until they reached the fence line again. Back at the car, Shaq popped the trunk, pulling out a hard case. Inside, a field scanner and drive cloner. They didn't just need to leave with what they found. They needed to digitize, transmit, and secure it before it disappeared again. An hour later, at Delaney's backup space, an old micro-recording studio above a closed jazz club, they uploaded the full haul, manifestos, ID logs, photos, the Preston image, the burn list. It was more than evidence. It was legacy, proof of an organization that operated like a private government beneath the one people voted for. Shaq stared at the screen. "They never stopped," he said. "They just got better at hiding." Delaney looked up. What if the warehouse wasn't just a meeting space?
What do you mean?
What if it was a training site, a place where they tested loyalty, broke people down, built them back up? Shaq considered it. Then Kendrick might have been there, might have seen it, or worse. She didn't let him finish. "I want him back, Shaq. We're going to get him." As they sat in the dim light of the studio, surrounded by history-turned evidence, Shaq knew the war had changed. They weren't chasing ghosts anymore. They were chasing architects. And some of them were still building. When you're close to truth, they turn off the lights. It started with a flicker. A streetlight sputtered on Maple and 12th, then blinked out like a dying star. Then came the silence. Not the soft, nighttime quiet Shaq had grown used to in the outer blocks of town, but a blanket hush, electric and unnatural. The kind that settles when everything stops working at once. Inside Midnight Brew, the record player froze mid-note. The espresso machine hissed and sighed into stillness. Delaney looked up from her laptop, confusion tightening her brow. "Breaker?" she asked. Shaq shook his head slowly, already standing. He'd felt something different in the air all day. Movement, tension. Now it had a face. Then the text came through. On the burner phone Shaq kept sealed in a Faraday pouch behind a vent in his wall. A line with no number ID. Just 3 words.
"They're coming. Clean."
He didn't hesitate. He grabbed the pouch, opened the second compartment, and pulled out the hardened drive. Everything they had, every file from the warehouse, every burn list, every photo was stored on it. Triple encrypted, air-gapped. If they were going to delete anything, they'd have to come for the source. Delaney was already gathering gear. her tablet, 2 flash drives, a folded sheet of codes handwritten in ink only she could decipher. The lights didn't come back on. In fact, the entire grid across 3 counties went dark within the next 5 minutes. Gas stations shut down. ATM networks froze. Phones switched to SOS mode. The only functional line? The emergency channel routed through government towers, a channel Shaq's burner still connected to. They're not trying to crash the city, Delaney said. They're trying to erase it. Shaq nodded. Scrubbing time. Like a hard reset, any trace of activity from the last 48 hours disappears. Which meant their evidence, their trail, their leverage. Shaq flipped the burner open and typed out a single message to a contact he'd never seen, never spoken to. Frost, engage. The reply came instantly. Meet, Hallow Ground, 33.7740 Tergrier, N, 84.3956 Terg W, no tail. He memorized the coordinates. Georgia State's abandoned courthouse annex, a building scheduled for demolition just like the warehouse. The irony wasn't lost on him. They always met where history was meant to be forgotten. Delaney tightened her coat. What about the cafe? If they want it, they'll take it, Shaq said. But they can't take you. I'm not hiding. You're not. You're preserving the story. That's more dangerous to them than either of us. She hesitated, but she saw in his face what he didn't say aloud. This wasn't about saving files anymore. It was about surviving long enough to expose the lie. Shaq gave her the burner. Go dark. Use only the codes. If I don't check in within 12 hours, go public. All of it. Delaney's voice dropped to a whisper. You trust this Frost? No, Shaq replied. I trust what he fears. By the time Shaq reached the edge of downtown, the few remaining streetlights were pulsing erratically. The courthouse annex loomed like a cathedral swallowed by time. Ivy crept across its brick like veins. He stepped inside through a side access door, flashlight off, moving quiet. The courtroom was colder than expected. Benches still intact, though layered with dust. He stood beneath the judge's bench and waited. 10 seconds, then 20, then the sound. Soft, almost imperceptible. Footsteps. From the shadows emerged a man in a dark wool coat, clean-shaven, hair silver at the temples, eyes like frostbite. This was Kellen Frost. He didn't offer a greeting. You triggered a full trace protocol, Frost said. They know it's you. Shaq kept his expression flat. They already knew. Now they're reacting. Frost's voice was gravel. Do you know what they've done in the last 12 hours? Tell me. 3 whistleblowers disappeared. Lana Morse was taken off-grid from her Augusta home. No break-in, no calls, just gone. One of our internal servers melted. Physically. Burnt from the inside out. Someone used high-frequency overclocking to destroy the hardware. Who has that kind of access? Frost didn't answer, which meant the answer was closer than either of them wanted to admit. Shaq pulled out the hard drive. Everything's here. But you need to understand something. They're not rogue. They're organized, layered. There are state signatures on multiple transfers. This isn't just a cover-up. This is policy. Frost studied him. How far are you willing to take this? Shaq looked him dead in the eye. To the dirt. Frost's face twitched, something between approval and regret. They'll come for you next, he said. Publicly. They'll flip the story. Make you the threat. The rogue agent. The unstable ex-celebrity. They'll drag your name until there's nothing left. I'm not doing this for my name. Frost nodded once. Then you need to disappear for 72 hours. Let me move this evidence up the chain. Secure, unbreakable. Shaq handed over the drive. Delaney? Frost asked. She's alive, but they know she's the voice, which means she's next. Frost paused. I can offer safe house placement. Anonymous, out of state. She won't go. Not until she finds her brother. At that, Frost's posture changed. His eyes narrowed. I ran your file again, Frost said. Kendrick Rivers. He's not in any active facility, not even the private ones. I know, Shaq said. Then why haven't you told her? Shaq's voice dropped. Because I don't want her to lose the one thing that makes her dangerous. Hope. They left through different exits. Frost with the evidence, Shaq into the thickening dark. By the time he reached the outskirts of the city, the blackout had spread. No signal, no cell towers. Even emergency radios were emitting static. The Iron Fathers weren't just erasing evidence. They were rewriting the moment, resetting perception. He pulled into the back lot of an old church Delaney had once used to host her podcast live. The building had been condemned, but the bell tower was structurally sound. From up there he could see the entire grid, dark, pulsing, almost alive. And then, in the distance, a single light blinked on. It wasn't power. It was a flare. From Delaney. A signal. She was still moving, still speaking, which meant the message wasn't dead yet. And as long as it lived, so did the fight. When you finally meet the man behind the curtain, hope is a dangerous expectation. The sky over the Appalachian foothills was gray and restless. A ceiling of unease stretched tight across the morning. Shaq had been driving since before dawn, following coordinates sent through a burner number marked with a single name, Frost. The message was short, direct. Meet me where they buried the files, not the truth. Attached was a set of GPS coordinates that led him to a decommissioned listening post just off Highway 74, surrounded by pine trees and memory. The building was nothing from the outside. Cinder block walls, paint peeling, a chain-link fence twisted at one corner. But Shaq knew what it had been. A Cold War-era surveillance outpost for the NSA, mothballed, officially repurposed, but never really closed. These were the kinds of places people used when they needed to talk without being overheard. Inside, the air was stale. A projector buzzed in the corner. One table, 2 chairs, no tech, no files, just the man waiting for him, already seated in the dim light. Kellen Frost. He looked older, up close, not aged, worn. Like a man who'd spent too long watching lies become policy and truth become risk. His eyes were pale, like winter mist, and they didn't blink much. "You came alone," Frost said, not as a question but a measurement. Shaq sat across from him. Didn't have a choice. Frost studied him. "You always had a choice. You just stopped believing in the ones they gave you." Shaq leaned forward. "Why now? Why bring me in if you knew this was never sanctioned?" Frost cracked his knuckles slowly, methodically. "Because you're the only one dumb enough to keep going, and smart enough to know when you're being lied to. That combination's rare these days." Shaq didn't flinch. "Start talking." Frost exhaled, then began. Vale wasn't supposed to be on that case. He requested it personally, off the books. He'd traced the Iron Father's network to 4 counties. He had names. One of them was a lieutenant named Eldon Hart, 3rd generation, embedded in internal affairs. Hart was his key. The plan was simple. Flip Hart. Get him to testify. Use him to crack the rest open. Shaq's jaw tightened. Hart disappeared. Frost nodded. 1 week before the scheduled debrief. Vale thought it was a bluff that Hart was in a safe house. He wasn't. He was dead. Burned in a staged arson outside Huntsville. But by the time that got confirmed, it was too late. Vale had already gone public, internally. Sent a memo up the chain. That's when they moved on him. Shaq's voice dropped. They called it suicide. Frost looked down. We both know it wasn't. The silence between them stretched. Then Shaq asked the question he'd buried for too long. Who gave the order to shut him down? Frost didn't answer immediately. Instead, he opened a worn folder from his coat pocket and slid it across the table. Inside was a printout of a personnel directive, marked confidential. Shaq read it once, then again. Marla Keene. Deep cover assignment. Signed off by Kine. Overlapping timeline with Vale's final weeks, Frost said quietly. She wasn't supposed to be involved in the Iron Father's case, but her name kept showing up in approvals, granting clearances, reassigning key witnesses. Shaq's stomach dropped. She greenlit my operation. Frost leaned in. Because she needed a distraction. Someone with enough visibility to keep the Bureau's attention focused outward, while she finished cleaning house from the inside. Shaq's breath slowed. The gears in his mind turned faster. That explains the delay in response, the lack of backup. Every time I got closer, the system stalled me. Frost nodded. You weren't just unprotected. You were bait. Shaq stood, paced the length of the room. Why me? Why pick me? Frost hesitated. Then because you carry weight. Not just physically. Symbolically. You're visible. Big enough to cast a shadow. But just noble enough that when you fall, the narrative writes itself. The ex-hero. The fallen star. The failed experiment. Shaq stopped in his tracks. You're saying they planned to burn me. I'm saying they're doing it now. Shaq clenched his fists. Took a breath. Released it. Why tell me this? Why now? Frost looked up, eyes sharper now. Because I was the one who brought Vale in. I trained him. Recruited him. I watched him burn. Because I thought I could control the fire. I was wrong. Shaq sat again. Quieter. And kin? Frost exhaled. Marla Keene was married to Jonathan Rutledge, Cole's older brother, former military logistics. Died 10 years ago under mysterious circumstances. A helicopter training accident, they said. But he was the link between the Iron Fathers and black-budget contracting work. Shaq's hands tightened around the edges of the folder. She married into it. And then she weaponized it, Frost said. Used bureau infrastructure to shield her network. Cleared cases. Buried whistleblowers. You weren't her first deployment, Shaq. You were her cleanup crew. Shaq's voice was ice. What's her endgame? Frost leaned forward. Power without accountability. Influence beneath the law. The Iron Fathers believe in bloodlines and control. She believes in immunity. Together they run the game. Cops, judges, private contractors. And the public? They just see headlines. Agent under investigation. Reputation questioned. No comment at this time. That's the script. Shaq stared at the wall for a long time. She's still in the bureau. Yes, Frost said. And she knows you're coming. Shaq turned to him. You going to help me? Frost's lips curled into a tired smirk. I just did. Shaq picked up the folder. Inside was not only Keene's operational directives, but also a list of shell companies tied to her signature. One of them, Claybridge LLC, had processed Kendrick Rivers's transfer order. Shaq looked up. This gives me a shot. Frost nodded. A small one. Don't miss. As Shaq stepped out into the chill morning light, he felt the weight of truth press into his chest like a stone. Everything he'd feared was real, and everything he hadn't feared was worse. Kendrick wasn't collateral. He was a blueprint. And Shaq's own handler was the one holding the pen. When they come for your name, you leave behind the truth. In the war against the invisible, truth wasn't a bomb. It was a slow burn, a frequency that couldn't be unheard once released. Shaq stood in the hollowed-out back room of a closed-up radio repair shop, one of Delaney's last safe zones, staring at the equipment spread before him like tools on a surgeon's table. Wires, mics, storage drives, a shortwave signal booster connected to an offline repeater. Everything he needed to do what he had avoided until now, go public. The town was cracking. Since the blackout, murmurs had turned to questions. Local news anchors stumbled through vague reports of infrastructure failure. The sheriff's office held a press conference and dodged every inquiry about internal sabotage or officer misconduct. But no one mentioned the arrests. No one mentioned the missing people. The narrative was being scrubbed in real time. Shaq wasn't going to let it be rewritten. He inserted the final drive. 32 minutes of recordings, all time-stamped, layered with metadata, and structured into chapters. Rutledge's racial slurs during stops. Private meetings held off-duty in restricted warehouses. A senior officer joking about flipping the script on the loud ones. Then came the clipped phone call between Marla Kine and an unknown party. If O'Neill pushes any further, we'll drop the mental health narrative. Discredit the investigation before it spreads. It wasn't a threat. It was policy. Shaq stared at the waveform on the screen, hands steady. Delaney walked in, boots quiet against the floor, carrying a thermos of black coffee and a manila folder. She said nothing as she handed it over. Inside was a layout for the revived podcast launch, retitled Crossroads, not just a name, a statement. The people who've been watching, she said, they're ready, but they don't trust the news, or the government, or even me, not anymore. They trust sound, raw sound. This has to feel unedited. Shaq nodded. It is. They got to work. She spliced the audio, cutting only for clarity, not comfort. No background music, no emotional cueing, just reality. Cold, present, undeniable. They structured it into 4 segments: the pattern, the players, the cover, the consequence. Delaney recorded her intro in a single take. You don't know what you're walking through until someone switches the lights on. Welcome to Crossroads. By dawn, the first episode was uploaded. Quietly, anonymously, scattered across public cloud buckets, mirror sites, open source networks. Within 2 hours, it hit 5,000 streams, then 15,000. By noon, it had reached half the state. People listened, and they reacted. Students at Lanier College walked out mid-class, holding cardboard signs that read, "You see us now?" Church leaders called emergency prayer circles. A coalition of pastors and organizers filed a joint petition demanding an independent review of the sheriff's department. Protesters gathered outside county offices, holding photos of the disappeared. Kendrick Rivers, Ronald May, Lana Morse. Shaq watched from a rooftop across the street, dressed in plain clothes, anonymous now by necessity. He wasn't afraid, he was methodical. Every protester was being filmed by plainclothes officers. Every chant was logged. But they weren't afraid either, because something had shifted. The sheriff's department held another press conference. Sheriff Hammond, Sweat shining under the camera lights, denied everything, called the podcast manipulated, and the recordings taken out of context. He promised a full internal review and closed the session after 2 questions. But it was the footage Shaq leaked that burned hotter. Using a hidden body cam embedded in his lapel, he'd captured a confrontation 2 days earlier, staged in the garage of a private security company with known ties to Claybridge LLC. Rutledge had shown up, arrogant, confident, until Shaq asked him one question. How many of us have to disappear before your system's clean? Rutledge smirked. You think they disappeared? They were corrected. The words caught like dry brush and fire. The phrase corrected trended for 2 days, repurposed by protest banners, graffiti walls, and a hacked sheriff department webpage that was replaced briefly by a black screen and the text, "We are not your correction." Still, Shaq knew a story alone wasn't enough. He needed testimony. He needed the missing. That's when the burner buzzed again. Delaney picked it up. She recognized the number. It's Micah. She put him on speaker. I cracked the Claybridge courier log, Micah said. There's a listed facility tied to a Florida State Farm Shell company. It's not on maps, but there's delivery documentation for medical supplies and biometric scanning gear. One of the shipments was signed for by a Kendrick R. Delaney's voice caught. Where? Off-grid, near Ocala. I'm sending you coordinates. Shaq closed his eyes. It was real. The ghost had a location. Micah paused before disconnecting. And Shaq, they know. Your name's all over bureau chatter now. You're not invisible anymore. He hung up. Shaq stared at the map Micah sent. Florida. Remote. A known trafficking corridor once investigated for inmate abuse. Shut down, allegedly. Delaney watched him carefully. You're going to go. I have to. She nodded. Slow and heavy. You bring him back. Or at least, bring the truth about him. Shaq stood. You keep the story alive. No matter what. Delaney handed him a new drive, one with every episode of Crossroads mirrored in 10 formats, ready to be released with a timed trigger. You disappear for more than 72 hours. This goes global, she said. No pressure, he smiled. But his eyes didn't. That night, as the town buzzed with protest, and the bureau scrambled to save face, one man drove south under cover of darkness, carrying nothing but proof and the unbearable weight of unfinished truth. And behind him, the fire kept spreading. Because they didn't just awaken the people. They gave them the microphone. Justice doesn't need fists, just a voice that won't quiet down. The morning sky hung low like it was waiting for something to break. Not a storm, not thunder, something quieter, final. In the alley behind the county precinct, Shaq sat in his car, eyes closed, hands resting on the wheel, heartbeat steady, not calm, controlled. Inside the glove box, a folded envelope rested on top of the hard drive Delaney had handed him. His insurance, his legacy, the raw cut of the truth. The precinct hadn't changed. The same flag with the frayed edge. The same memorial plaque at the front honoring officers lost in service. No names of the ones they'd buried in secrets. Shaq stepped out, coat zipped, lapel camera activated. The transmitter stitched inside his sleeve blinked once. Signal live, feed transmitting. He walked past the front desk without a word. No badge flash. No authorization. Just presence. People turned. Heads followed. A whisper moved faster than he did. By the time he reached the main bullpen, half the precinct was still trying to process how Shaquille O'Neal, former NBA legend, current federal ghost, was standing unarmed, unescorted, and walking toward the glass-walled conference room like he owned the air. Behind the glass sat Sheriff Hammond, Cole Rutledge, and 3 internal advisors. The weekly operations meeting. Shaq pushed the door open without knocking. Every head turned. Hammond rose first. Surprise giving way to anger. Mr. O'Neal, you're not? I am, Shaq said, and I'm recording. He stepped inside. Let the door close behind him. No retreat, just one way forward. Rutledge leaned back, smug. You got 5 seconds before this becomes trespassing. Shaq locked eyes with him. Already was, just not mine. He turned to Hammond. You know who I am. You know why I'm here. But what you don't know is how many people are watching this moment. Live. A beat. The advisors shifted uncomfortably. One reached for a folder. Another checked his phone. But there was no signal jam this time. Delaney's repeater ensured that the feed was public, unfiltered, streaming from 7 proxy sites and mirrored to data vaults in 3 countries. Shaq walked to the center of the room. I didn't come here to fight. I didn't come here to expose. I came to speak. Because somewhere along the way, This badge stopped meaning protection and started meaning permission. Permission to profile, permission to disappear people, permission to rewrite the law, based on lineage and skin. He reached into his coats, slowly. No panic. No sudden moves. From his inside pocket, he pulled out a photo. Kendrick Rivers, 17, taken the week before his arrest. He placed it on the table. His name is Kendrick. He was taken under your authority, falsely charged, transferred to a ghost facility. I found the documents, the sign-offs, the trail. I found the people who signed their names to lies and called them corrections. Hammond's jaw clenched. We've been through this. No, you haven't, Shaq cut him off. Because if you had, this room wouldn't still be full of men paid to protect their reflection instead of their communities. Rutledge chuckled under his breath. You're playing hero in the wrong movie, big man. Shaq turned to him. Slower this time. I've seen the files. I've read the burn lists. You called Preston Vale a suicide. I call it what it was. Execution, carried out by men too coward to wear hoods, so they wear armor instead. The room thickened with silence. Shaq dropped a flash drive onto the table. On here are recordings of you, Rutledge, planning arrests, mocking policies, referring to re-education centers as cleanup sites, and of your network officers who funneled youth into a privatized prison system operating outside state maps, funded by Shell Corps tied directly to federal grants, approved by one woman. He paused. Marla Keene. Now the air turned cold. That name cracked something. One of the advisors finally spoke. You've got no jurisdiction. You're off rotation. Disavowed. Shaq nodded. Which is exactly why I'm here as a man. Not a badge. Because even when they stripped my authority, they couldn't take my truth. He took a breath. This building may not see the chains it built, but the people outside do. Right now, they're watching. Parents, students, neighbors, journalists, activists, kids who've been pulled over for nothing, mothers who were told their sons overdosed but never got a coroner's photo. He looked straight at Hammond. They want to believe in something again. So either this house cleans itself, or they burn down your legacy with facts. Rutledge stood, jaw tight, voice low. You're making threats. No, Shaq said, calm and clear. I'm offering you a choice. He tapped the edge of the table once. Turn yourself in, step down, open the files, or watch the wave you started pull you under. Rutledge opened his mouth to speak, but the wall screen behind them suddenly lit up. A mirrored feed. The Crossroads podcast. Delaney's voice, mid-broadcast, reading the transcript of Rutledge's own words. One of the videos played behind her. Rutledge bragging about corrections, laughing with two other officers in an off-duty warehouse. The precinct erupted. Phones rang. Desks were abandoned. Outside, the crowd began to swell. Hundreds, then thousands, holding signs, shouting names, playing the feed over speakers, sharing it through live TikToks, Instagram streams, neighborhood radios. Shaq stepped out of the glass room without a backward glance. The officers in the hallway moved aside. Not one raised a hand. Not one dared. He walked through the precinct like it was the last hallway of a race. A finish line not marked by applause, but acknowledgement. Outside, the cameras caught him. Not as an agent. Not as a player. Not as a giant. But as a man. The man who refused to stay silent. The man who never raised a fist, but made the system bleed truth. And truth, once spoken, never disappears. The biggest giants never leave. They just carry others higher. The town had changed. Not completely. Not like a miracle. But like a wound that was finally being cleaned instead of ignored. The courthouse lawn was no longer just a strip of dry grass behind a rusting flagpole. Now it had rows of folding chairs, chalk drawings on the sidewalks, and a permanent mural of faces that had once been just case numbers, Kendrick Rivers among them. His eyes, painted soft but alert, watched the traffic with quiet defiance. It had been 4 months since the Crossroads broadcast. Since Shaq walked into that precinct and left the door wide open behind him. 4 months since the tapes were played on national radio. Since the city council voted to suspend Sheriff Hammond. And since Cole Rutledge was walked out of the station in cuffs with no reporters allowed inside. But the town still buzzed, not with fear, but awareness. People looked at each other longer now, not suspiciously, with purpose. Shaq stood at the corner of Main and Mayfield, sipping coffee from a plain white cup, watching as 3 teenagers finished installing a new community notice board. Not far from him, a girl read from a flyer aloud, her voice catching the air like wind through branches. They're launching a scholarship in his name, she said to her friend. Kendrick's, for kids who want to go into policy work. Shaq smiled faintly and turned. making his way down toward Midnight Brew, the cafe that no longer needed a closed sign. It stayed open past dusk now, lit by lanterns and humming voices. The inside smelled the same. Nutmeg, espresso, and vinyl records warmed from play. But the people had changed. They weren't just locals. Journalists, professors, students, organizers, they all came now to listen. Delaney stood behind the counter, braids pinned up, a pair of reading glasses perched on her nose. She was going over transcripts, editing the next episode of Crossroads, which was now syndicated in 12 states and streamed globally. Her voice, once pushed into quiet corners of the internet, now echoed in classrooms and courts. She looked up when Shaq entered. "You still taking that same seat like it's got your name on it?" He gave her the familiar smirk. "Habit." She poured him a fresh cup. "It's not the coffee you come here for." Never was. They didn't need to say it, but both knew the shadow still lingered. Even with arrests, even with reform bills in motion, even with Kine removed from the bureau and under federal review, her silence now broken by the files found in a cabin 3 states away, hidden logs, falsified records, and names only Frost had ever dared to connect. But it wasn't justice that haunted them. It was Kendrick. He was found 3 weeks after the first episode of Crossroads broke through national silence. Drugged, malnourished, locked inside a facility registered under a fake name in a Florida farming district. It wasn't a prison. Not by classification. It was called a behavioral maintenance farm, and according to the state it had never housed minors. Kendrick had no words when they found him. Not at first. He blinked at Shaq's face like he was a dream or a threat. Delaney had stood outside the facility's gates for over an hour before they let her through. When she finally walked in, Kendrick had turned toward the sound of her voice, not the words, the voice, like it was the last thing he remembered holding on to. He spoke 2 days later, slowly, simply, about dirt, about silence, about the lights they kept on all night, about the pills, and the rules, and the men who wore uniforms with no patches. It took weeks to stabilize him. He didn't remember dates, couldn't recall the last time he'd eaten something warm, but he remembered Shaq. "The man on the screen," he'd whispered, "the one who made the noise." Now he lived with Delaney in a shared brownstone uptown, private care, trauma therapy. He didn't say much, but when he did, it was always measured, like every word had to earn its right to be spoken. His presence became part of the cafe's quiet myth. Customers rarely saw him, but some swore they had. He'd pass through, headphones on, nodding faintly, still healing, but not erased. Shaq took his usual seat by the window. Delaney came around with her cup and sat across from him. "Got a call from City Hall today," she said. "They want to name the new youth center after you." Shaq raised a brow. "That's not necessary." Delaney shrugged. "They think it is." He looked out the window for a moment. "Name it after Vale. He was first. He bled first." She nodded. "You sure?" "I'm sure." Outside, more kids gathered around the mural wall. One of them held up a phone and started reading from Shaq's old court statement, the words he spoke during the precinct confrontation. His words had become sermon. "They turned your voice into curriculum," Delaney said, smiling. Shaq sipped his coffee. "Words matter." "You think it's over?" "No. But it's begun." That night, a vigil was held on the courthouse steps. Not for the dead, but for the returned. Kendrick lit the last candle, hands trembling but steady. Delaney held his shoulder. Behind them, Shaq stood with Frost, now fully retired but not silent. His role had been made public, the mentor who finally chose truth over clearance. Cameras flashed, but Shaq didn't flinch. He wasn't hiding anymore. Not behind titles, not behind roles, just himself. Later, as the crowd thinned, a boy no older than 10 approached him. "You real?" he asked. Shaq knelt to his height. "What do you mean?" The boy pointed to the mural. "People say you're too big to be real. Like you were made to scare the bad ones." Shaq chuckled. "No, kid, I'm real. Just big enough to carry what they can't." The boy smiled. "Then carry this too." He handed Shaq a drawing. It was stick figures, a tall one, standing in front of a small one. Above it, a sun, and one word, safe. Shaq folded the drawing gently and placed it in his coat. As the night settled, and the town softened into lights and low hums, Shaq walked back toward the cafe, past the mural, past the crowd, past the whispers. He didn't walk like a giant. He walked like someone who'd finally laid the weight down. And in his place, he left a voice. Not louder, just permanent, still standing. Think this story ends here? It doesn't. Because the real system it exposes is still breathing. If this shook you, ask why it felt so familiar. Talk louder, dig deeper, ask better questions, especially when they want silence. Truth didn't just knock in this story, it kicked the damn door down. Now it's your move.